is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
The Limits of Democracy in Passion for Truth award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. Does the fighting in Iraq meet the standard definition of a civil war? The scholarly definition has two main criteria. The first is that the warring groups must be from the same country and fighting for control of the political center. The second says that at least 1,000 people must have been killed in total, with at least 100 from each side. Does the level of violence in Iraq meet the definition of a civil war? If so, is a political solution, not a military one, necessary to end the civil war in Iraq? We'll ask our guests, Anne Buwalda, senior attorney from the Jubilee Campaign International. She has done a lot of distinguished work on cases related to domestic and international terror. Senator Cuccinelli, State Senator Cuccinelli, Virginia State Senator Cuccinelli. Chuck Woolery, formerly from the World Federalist Association. The objective of the World Federalist Association is to strengthen UN. And Dr. Dennis Warner from Pax Christi, the International Catholic Peace Movement. Dr. Warner has worked in more than 50 countries for a variety of international, governmental and private organizations. He recently returned from Ethiopia. Tim Ferriss, news commentator and a legal analyst. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Starting with you, and does the level of violence in Iraq meet the definition of a civil war?
I believe that the level of violence most certainly does and has. I don't think it's objective analysis to be claiming that it's not a civil war. It's so obvious that the factions have an agenda to go after the center of power, and they've been doing so in such a way as perpetrating well over 1,000 people dying a year. So definitely the definition is fulfilled. I think what's lacking here is the honesty of those who can do something about it in order to address the situation and change it.
Senator Cuccinelli, it has elements of both an insurgency as well, or what?
No question. I mean, there certainly are the elements of a civil war. However, there's more than that present. You've got those who are essentially proxy fighters for Iran, for instance. You've got what amount to terrorist groups that have been bringing people into the country to engage in combat with U.S. troops. And you have U.S. and British and other foreign troops that are present, essentially attempting to stabilize that center, whatever it may be. So you've got more than just a traditional civil war going on. I mean, when Americans think of civil war, they think of 1861 to 65, and there were two sides, and most everybody else stayed out. And that is not what we have in Iraq.
Chuck, one side is struggling to topple a legitimate government. Does that meet the criteria of a civil war?
I would think that legitimacy is kind of in the eye of the beholder on this end of the realm. That the idea of a civil war, it's kind of an oxymoron. I don't know if war in any way can be civil. But the appalling thing for me is that there have been somewhere between, the 3,000 American lives that have been lost. They're certainly horrific, but that there has been over 100,000 to maybe 500,000 to 600,000 Iraqis killed is just mind-boggling. That if we had that kind of lethality in a conflict here in the United States, taking out that percentage of our population, we would not put up with it. Whatever the instigator of that problem was would be gone. I just find it appalling that that's not the issue here, that number of that death toll, and it's actually increasing by each week, that isn't the primary issue here, that stopping that death toll. And I don't think 20,000 more troops is going to stop that in any way, shape, or form.
Where do you come on it, Dennis?
It seems to me it's irrelevant what we call it. Why are we so concerned about the term civil war? It's almost as if it's yes or no, it triggers some kind of action by the U.S. government. Whatever it is, whether it's an insurgency, a revolution, a civil war, or some other kind of activity. You've got a horrible situation happening. You've got internal conflicts, ethnic, religious, political divisions. You've got widespread instability and insecurity throughout the country. You've got several groups that are anxious to to bring down whatever passes for government. So it's just a terrible situation, but I have this feeling that the U.S. government and the press have been focused on a word as if somehow it is a trigger or some kind of stage. If we can define it as such, then we can take a next step. That shouldn't be the case.
In ethnic or religious terms, Tim, what happened in India in the 80s could also be categorized as civil war, going by this definition, do you think?
In some ways, clearly. You had the independence movements in Punjab, Khalistan, and Kashmir, and Nagaland, all of which were linguistically, ethnically, culturally different things from the Hindu majority. So in some ways, clearly it could be. There are, however, a lot of differences in the situation as well. There aren't all these extraneous other things going on.
But they ignited they say that during the 80s, the Sikh leaders ignited the cycles of violence in the country.
Well, both sides engage in some degree of violence. You know, the Punjab State Magistracy did a report on the death toll there. Their figures and those of the human rights groups were reported in Inderjeet Singh Jeji's book, The Politics of Genocide, and it was 250,000 people. Our own State Department said that in a year they paid 41,000 cash bounties for killing Sikhs. One guy got a bounty for shooting up a 3-year-old kid.
Okay. U.S. is involved in multiple civil wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Somalia. Can the American military succeed in such situations? And here the civil wars are fought over smaller issue of who runs the country, not how it is run. We'll ask our panelists next, is it possible, Senator Cuccinelli, for the outsiders to stop civil wars?
Is it possible? Yes. And that's going to vary situation to situation. However, when you go in, compare this round in Iraq with early 90s, and people think of Colin Powell and the overwhelming force they brought in that particular instance. If you don't go into another country with overwhelming force, you aren't going to be able to stop everyone else from fighting. And there's, you know, the 20,000 troop surge is not the kind of overwhelming force that we've seen historically relative to the problem that they're dealing with historically in the last 15 or 20 years. That's nowhere near it being in the same league. I mean, this will require Iraqi participation and ultimate control of the conflict itself before you start to see any stability to the situation.
And in that vein, where's our air power? We came in with shock and awe. We made a big fuss from the air. I don't think we've used the air power since then. Where is it?
Are foreigners in any good position, Dennis, to stop the civil wars, help one side defeat the other?
Well, if we talk about Iraq, I don't think we can. I think we're part of the problem. We're not the solution. We've put the country into a situation where we've gotten diverse groups to not only dislike each other more than they did in the past, but they intensely dislike the American occupation. And until the occupation ends, I don't think the conflict will have a chance of ending. Ironically, I think that there is a greater chance of ending the conflict, the civil war, or whatever it's called in Iraq, if the U.S. was out, but used its influence, its economic and political power to bring in other entities to work with the Iraqis to help mitigate the troubles. But we can't do it there. But every country is unique. That's the way it is in Iraq. Other countries, we may have different approaches.
What do you say to Dennis' remarks and that they can influence in terms of power sharing agreement between the warring groups?